Welcome back. I wanted to give you a quick primer of SQL Management Studio. Um, you can download the software on the wiki link that's posted in Sakai. Once you've downloaded it, SQL Server comes in sort of two parts. One is the database itself, which is running on. Okay, so there's a database that's hosted in Amazon, and there's also a database that comes um, with SQL Server when you install it. For instance, if I look at services.msc, under services.msc, I have a local copy of the database running, probably a couple of them on this machine, but a local copy of the database running under, if you look under SQL Server, MS SQL SQL Server, and I have an instance called SQL Server Express. I don't use them that much, but when I do, I have to start the services. So the database is sort of a started task that runs in the background, that's waiting for, that has listeners waiting for requests and so forth. So that's part one. Part two is the database IDE. In other words, the thing that interacts with the database. That's what Management Studio is. Um, Sign on to the server that's in the wiki with the credentials that we know. Use the SQL Server authentication. Now you notice when you sign in, I have a few things going on. First of all, let's stay within databases for now. Don't worry about this stuff for now. I've got two databases that are served for our project. One's called Volunteer and one's called ASP.NET Provider. ASP.NET Provider is a schema of all the objects needed for the ASP.NET authentication, sign-on, role management, stuff like that. This actually comes from Microsoft. There's a program that will generate this automatically. I didn't make any changes to it other than there's data changes, but schema changes and store procedure changes I didn't make. Let's try not to make any in this provider. Our database is called Volunteer. Under Volunteer, we have a few different options. One's tables, database diagrams if you wanted to create a quick and dirty ER diagram, that's what that's for. Tables, views, synonyms, programmability, service broker, storage, and security. Tables. This is where you would create, change, alter tables, whether they're system tables or our own schema tables. If you look really close, dbo.skill, that's actually the schema name .table name. So I have a schema name that comes automatically with SQL Server called DBO. And under that I have a table called skill. Under that table I have a number of columns: skill ID, skill name, master skill ID. If you look real close, I see icons looks like a golden key and like a gray key. That means primary key and foreign key. The other one just means it's a regular attribute. I probably have a primary key and a foreign key, right? A primary key, and that's tied to this skill ID, and this foreign key tied to master skill ID. If I had any constraints, which I don't, but if I had it like a check constraint, making sure that I don't know that a column passed regular expressions, or that a column had a range. In other words, let's say zip code, for instance. Zip code is a 5-digit number for United States. Well, if I have a data type of a number, doesn't have to be a 5-digit number. Could be a 2-digit number. Could be a 9-digit number. So what if you wanted to make sure that it was just 5 digits? You might want to do that with a check constraint. Triggers. Triggers are I don't have any triggers on the tables yet, but a trigger would be code that you want to run based on an event. So for instance, as a record is inserted into the skills database, I want some other action to happen. Indexes. Well, a primary key automatically comes with an index. PK skill is an index, but if you wanted other indexes, like a non-unique or unique index on a different field, that's where these would be done. So tables, we'll get into more in depth with tables. If I wanted to create a new table, the quickest way, right-click the tables folder, go to New Table, and it brings up the table dialog. Eventually, you'll have to trust me on this. It's bringing up the table dialog. I could also go to New Query. I don't know if you saw that, but there's a button called New Query up top. I pick my database that I want the target for, type in my query, click execute. So if I typed in, hold on one sec. I just noticed that the screen wasn't at the top. I expanded my screen. If I wanted to type in the SQL manually, I'd hit New Query, make sure that Volunteer or whatever database I want to as a target is selected here, and then enter the query and click Execute. In other words, I don't have to use the IDE to create tables and indexes and such. Down to views, a view is nothing but a saved query. So in other words, if I wanted, let's say down the road we have a few tables and we have some complication. In other words, one table or another may be pretty complicated to get through. I'll give you an example. Back in the ASP provider, I've got a view called VW ASP.NET users. And if I look at this, sorry for the delay. Okay, this pretty much doesn't look like. Okay, so what did this view do? If I look at the ASP.NET users table, there's more columns than this probably. So if I wanted to restrict column usage, what I would do is create a view which would exclude the columns I don't want you to see, and then give the person access to the view and not the table. Let's see users and roles. Let's see if that was a little bit more complicated. Users and roles. Again, it looks like it's just a straight view off the users and roles table. This looks like a method or a way to do abstraction. Let's take a look at membership users. I think this one's a little bit more complicated. This one's probably looking at membership and users and joining them together and all kinds of cool stuff. Yeah, okay. So I've got two tables, ASP.NET membership, ASP.NET users. I've got a relationship between the two, user ID. And what this will do, when I run this, it'll give me a list of users and the membership that they have. So if I look at it, so I'll have, here's a user ID, probably in here somewhere is a username, and what memberships they belong to. Pretty neat stuff. Let me close this guy. Go back over to my other database and go back into Programmability. So Programmability, in here I can create stored procedures, functions, database triggers. In other words, a trigger that's looks at the database level, i.e., let's say you wanted a trigger that would fire when an object is dropped. Like in other words, if you dropped a table, that's what database triggers would do. In other words, let's say somebody wants an email every time a table's dropped. You would do that as a database trigger. A stored procedure. I'll give you an example of a stored procedure. Again, going back to the good old ASP.NET. If we go to stored procedures and look at, let's see. Let's see. If I wanted to create a role, for instance, just create a role. I've right-clicked and clicked Modify. This is the code that's required to create a role. So if you pass in a given application name and a given role name, this procedure will go out, check to see if that role exists, check to see if the application exists. If both exist, then create the role. Pretty neat stuff. It'll end up executing this script, which is insert into the roles table, application role, lowered role name, and it's doing all that based on the checks that are above. If I want to delete a role, same idea. This is probably going to use the same signature. The application, well, I bet you this has a Boolean on it to say whether or not to delete it if people exist on it. So this says, yeah, exactly. So application name, role name, delete only if role is empty. In other words, somebody has this role. What happens if you have the role? So let's take a look. If he says yes, let's do that. Well, guess what we have to do before we do this? We have to go out and clean up this table, the users and roles table. In other words, kick the people off that role if they have it before I delete it. So that's the idea behind stored procedures. Again, I can give you a 3-hour lecture how to do every single kind of stored procedure. Just know that stored procedures are housed there. Functions, database triggers, and so forth. Got one more thing for you, and that's who has access to these things. So if I go to Programmability and I go back to that create role, if I go to the properties of that stored procedure, under permissions, under permissions, it'll show me who has who has access to execute this stored procedure. There's a role called ASP.NET Role Full Access, and that has execute authority for that stored procedure. So in other words, if somebody had sign-on and didn't have this role, they couldn't do this function. So then the question is, who has this role? If I go back over to security for the database, go to roles, go to database roles, and I'm looking for role access. One of these suckers is role access, basic access, personalization, profile, basic, roles, basic, full access. I double click this guy. This will tell me two things. It'll tell me what it has, the securables, and it's telling me that these things are secured by this role, and also tell me who has it. So if I go to general, it should say that's the schema owners by this role. Access, okay. Then I'm looking for, okay. So members of this role, it doesn't look like, it doesn't appear that people aren't in this role. So how could this be executed? And what it is if you have a certain, there are users that are out here, and let's give you an example. CSC475 is a user that we signed on, and this one has authority for probably everything. So this, in other words, the authority in the way it's delegated, it's hierarchical in nature. In other words, if I have everything, then you have to tell it what you don't have. So this is general. Let's see. It owns DBO schema. I'm looking to see what schema it owns besides DBO. There's no other owned schemas. DB owner. So the DB owner's role, the DB owner role trumps the rest of these roles. So if I have DB owner, well, then I have all this other stuff, all this ASP.NET membership and so forth. This is like sort of the, I want to say the DBA role, if you will. We don't give this DB owner out too often. And the reason why I put it on this CIS 475 user ID is because I don't want, when people are creating stored procedures and so forth, I don't want to run against authority issues. Very good. So this is just, again, just a quick primer how to maneuver around SQL Server. I may give some more videos when we talk about deploys and how we do differences between databases, but this is just a first shot of how to move around the database. Thank you very much.